We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It is a pleasure to welcome back Jane McAlevey, organizer, author, scholar, currently a senior policy fellow at the University of California at Berkeley's Labor Center, part of the Institute for Labor and Employment Relations. And she has a new book out, A Collective Bargain, Unions, Organizing, and the Fight for Democracy. Jane McAlevey, welcome back to the program.
It is always a pleasure to be here. Hi, Sam.
Hi, Jane. Now, the last time time is completely flattened for me at this point. But you were here a couple of times in 2018. I think the last time you were here, we were talking about what is known as the Red State Rebellion. This was a half a dozen or so labor actions, strikes, if you will, by teachers across, I guess the Midwest and a little bit in the South. And since then, why don't you tell me, where are we relative to 2018 and what was 2019 like in terms of labor actions?
Yeah, we don't have the total numbers yet, but I think we're dare I say, we're trending in a good direction, because we can't say that about a whole lot of categories of the news today.
Right, so, that's true.
One of the things that's keeping me hopeful, quite frankly, is that the number of strikes is continuing. Now, it's not, so let's get back to the conversation we were having just to remind folks. So I did come on the last time, I think, to talk about the explosion of the strike that began in 2018 in West Virginia, where 34,000 teachers, school bus drivers, cooks, cleaners, the whole nine yards, walked off the job, shut the state down, and occupied the Capitol in a strike that for many came out of nowhere, though that certainly wasn't the case for the folks who were planning that strike in West Virginia. But and as you say, it began to spread. So there's several things that are happening at once. One is, we now know that in 2018, the largest number of workers in this country went on strike in over 30 years, which, when we get to how do we get out of the mess that we're in, day one of the Senate version of the completely skewed impeachment trial, how we get past the crisis of the democracy that we're having right now, I think one of the ways that we get past it and through it and out of it, quite frankly, is by using the same tools that trade unions and workers use when they're preparing for and coming out of massive strikes. So we can come back to that. But so the fact that 2019 continued, and what happened in 2019 is that the strikes moved into what we would call the blue states, in addition to that they stayed in some of the red states. But several things happened in 2019. We had huge, massive strikes in the state of California, from Los Angeles to Oakland and points in between. And we had private sector strikes, which is super important when we think about how do we affect the economy, how do we get corporations to, these guys are sitting over in Davos allegedly talking about climate as if they're concerned. How do we actually stop and reverse rampant income inequality? The key to it's going to be certainly a key is going to be a reinvigorated trade union movement and the ability of workers in this country to say, we're not coming to work anymore until you guys start sharing the pie. So that's the most exciting dynamic, I think, happening in the country is workers deciding once again in this country, no one's going to save them except themselves, and they're going to have to start taking pretty serious action to dent the current news cycle and to force policymakers to the table to share the wealth.
I want to talk about what the how that happens in terms of it being ordered, but I want to turn a little bit to the book. I mean, you had mentioned there was strikes going on, and you write about a couple of those, and I'll get to that in a second. But let's just start with this. You tackle some sort of the common myths of unions. What are those myths?
Yeah. I mean, the funny thing is that chapter of the book was the one that I was least interested in writing, and I think my very smart editor, Emma Janaski, insisted on it over and over. Why? Because she's a 27 and now 28-year-old young millennial editor who said, you don't understand. We don't even know what they do anymore, Jane, right? So a part of the point of the book is this book, which is very different than the previous ones, is to reach an audience that actually doesn't understand unions or what unions do or what we have the capacity to do. So that chapter of the book, I try and take on a set of common assumptions or a set of myths Unions are sexist, unions are racist, unions are corrupt, unions are fuddy-duddy, unions are old school, unions are irrelevant to today's economy. And I basically just take a whack at every single argument in there because none of it's true, right? The truth is, where you see the 20,000 person walkout at Google from last year moving is towards a lot of conversation in the high-tech sector right now about how are we going to have collective action? How are we going to try and force the Silicon Valley, the new power leader of the United States? How are we going to force the sort of high-tech sector, which, by the way, is the 5 largest, most wealthiest corporations in the world, are all the high-tech sector right now, right, globally. So, I just try and take a whack at each one of them. Look, is there sexism in unions? Absolutely. Is there racism in unions? Absolutely. What are unions? They are a reflection of the society in which we live. Do we want them to be better? Hell yes. Are good ones better than that? Way better, right? Every union I've ever worked with is literally, equally understood to be a force for the working class and against sexism, racism, homophobia, and every kind of ism that you can imagine. It's a place that actually creates a more fair and just workplace, not the opposite. But, do the limitations of the human species as we understand it in this country, enter into a trade union? Yeah, it's an institution of people. And part of why I am sticking with the union, as I say in the opening lines of the book, as a key strategy out of the crisis of this democracy, is because in some ways it is because trade unions sort of are this weird institutional force in America that unites very different people who don't share any common political belief the day they get hired, right? So it's like an example of how do you sit down with people who you don't have a shared identity with. Boss hires you, now you'll go work for some big company, you're a nurse in a hospital, whatever you are. You didn't walk into work because you pick, you don't get to pick your coworkers, right? The boss hires you and you go to work, and you're Republican, you're Democrat, you're probably like most people just sick of it all. You're not functioning, you're not participating in American democracy the way the framers kind of intended it, depending on who we are. So, it's part of what's beautiful about unions is they're messy and they're complicated, but at their very best, there is simply no replacing the ability to make radical progressive change in this country the way a good union can. And that, to me, is essential in 2020.
I want to talk about a couple of the strikes that you write about, but you also write about Silicon Valley. You just mentioned it. Like, how do you get, first of all, there's a sense, and you tell us if that sense is correct. There's a sense that people who work in those sectors are about as anti-union as you could get as a worker, I should say, right? That there's sort of like the philosophical, I guess, pedigree of people who work in tech is supposedly more libertarian and anti-union than that. But address that, and then also how you go about unionizing folks in that type of environment.
Sure. I think a few things are true. First is, it actually reminds me of one of the last topics of conversation we had before the teacher strikes began to break out, and that was around what was then called Murphy Oil, but it's what was renamed Epic Systems, right? Remember that? There was a call that you and I did where I was sort of freaking out about Murphy Oil. You were like, heck, we don't know the name of it, and they consolidated 3 cases of which Murphy Oil was one. And I want to start the conversation about Silicon Valley sort of from that conversation. So the Epic Systems ruling, which is linked to the Murphy Oil ruling, in some, and I cover it in the book, but in some essentially said, the Supreme Court of the United States essentially said, American workers, including in Silicon Valley and everywhere, are now able to be forced into what we call forced arbitration agreements. So your individual hire package, you're signing up the healthcare form, your schedule, your thing, your liability, and most workers don't even realize it. They sign little things saying, I agree to, binding forced arbitration by my employer to settle any disputes I may have with them. This is for folks who don't have a union, which, by the way, that's the vast majority of America right now.
Right.
So we know that even just since the ruling, a majority of American workers, hundreds of millions of people, are like being forced into these arbitration agreements. So how does this connect to the question you asked? The only way out of those forced arbitration agreements that say you can't protest sexual harassment, you can't talk about sexual harassment in the workplace, you can't have a class action lawsuit against your employer over sexism, racism, or fill in the blank issues at work anymore. The only way out of that and out from under those agreements is to form a union and to negotiate collectively with your employer. So to me, that even makes it more clear that if you're walking around Silicon Valley where the same forces that have tried to act like the great society was being created by the high-tech industry, you really don't have a choice at this point except to actually try to form something called a union to get out from really, really egregious, really bad individual hiring agreements that are rampant in Silicon Valley. So, a whole bunch of things. One is, I think,
and just to be clear,
feel like,
let me just so that people understand this dynamic. The idea is that if you don't have the power of a union, it's not even a question. It's if you don't have the cover almost on some level of like not be, because if you walk in there and say like, I'm not signing that, they're just going to say, fine, goodbye.
Bye.
And
goodbye.
That's it. Because I mean, on some level, it's like the dynamic where you have some retail outfits are like, yeah, I'm willing to pay, $15 an hour, but it's got to be the minimum wage because I can't compete against those other people who won't do it. And if it becomes a law for all of us, I mean, there's this strength in collectivity that benefits people who don't want to, because they're going to get it chopped off, stick out their neck alone in these instances.
Yeah. And so what's interesting is you saw this. Now we're going back a little over a year ago when the 20,000 Google workers first walked out, when they realized that one of the outgoing executives was getting this huge, reward for sexual harassment. I mean, he was being let go of, but on his way out the door, like lots of CEOs, they get these ridiculous multi-million-dollar packages as they leave. So a lot of the women workers at Google said this is an outrage. This is totally crazy. And they called for this big walkout. Fast forward a year and 3 months from now, because that was November of 2018, and you see what's really happening, which is that Google has now hired IRI Inc. That's one of the top union-busting firms in the United States of America. Interestingly, I write a lot about the impact and how IRI Inc., a professional union buster, works in a collective bargain, because in the chapter, which was the last big campaign that I was running on the ground in Philadelphia, where I talk about how workers can still form really strong unions in 2020, the workers in that campaign were going up against IRI Inc. Now, we won, and those workers have real protections and a collective bargaining agreement and a process to redress their abusive employers. At Google, where I do think that there are, as you say, there is this sort of idea that they're different, that they can individually work out their problems, that a union is part of a system that they want to disrupt, right? I mean, this would be the rap that they're running hard. And
right.
In the book, of course, on that chapter on tech, I give a long history from the early 1970s at Intel, where the Silicon Valley elite, as early as 1973, had it in their head that they were going to smash unions, that they understood that smashing workers' ability to force them to share their wealth was going to cut into their profit margin, right? So there's nothing new about what Google just did by hiring IRI Inc., a professional union-busting firm. And by the way, what you saw happen in December were 4 senior Google engineers fired who were involved in that protest a year earlier. So, I got to say to tech workers, there is nowhere to go but forming a union. I mean,
right.
People can try and get around it, but there is no – if you want to be able to try and clean up the disgusting sexist gender abuses and imbalances, let alone the racism inside of the tech worker world, which is big, there simply is no way around that collective action and collective power, but codified through workers themselves forming the kind of union that they want to build. There is no way around that, whether it's the tech sector, whether it's an Amazon workhouse, or whether it's the high-level coders I describe at the beginning of that chapter, like Taylor Hesselgrave, right, who's this $120,000 a year coder, comes out of a Hackbright Academy, where the slogan is, essentially changing Silicon Valley by changing the ratio. Like they train all these women as coders, they put them into these big firms, and they all wind up getting fired or quitting anyway because the conditions are disgusting and sexist, and it's rampant in Silicon Valley. So, people can look at like, how do we innovate something new, which I think is the rep in Silicon Valley. It's all about innovation. And I'm like, some things like real news matter, and some things like collective power where workers can stand up to their employer are as relevant today as they were 100 years ago on the factory floor. That's just a fact.
What's interesting about that story is the way that it shows the interplay between what, particularly in this season right now, the relationship between things like sexism and racism and class, in that the union addresses what problems the workers have may be at different times, may be unique to a specific industry or somewhat unique to a specific industry or a specific shop or whatnot. It is the fact that they're powerless, or the power dynamic is the thing that is consistent amongst all of the workers. The set of problems that powerlessness can't address may be different from shop to shop or industry to industry.
That's right. Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, the point of having a collective agreement is, one, to get out of the individual forced arbitration agreements, which are rampant in that industry and anyone who's hiring today, right? Especially since the 2018 Supreme Court ruling. I mean, we already had a lot of workers under forced arbitration agreements, and every time I check the statistic, it's climbing rampantly. So now it's up to 60%. I had a lawyer last week tell me they think it's going to hit 75% soon. We're talking about the overwhelming majority of American workers, those who don't have a union, being forced into agreements that say things as egregious as, you cannot talk to your coworker about your salary. You cannot talk to your coworker if you've been sexually harassed. You cannot talk to anyone but the HR director, even if that's the person who harassed you. I mean, the language in these arbitration agreements that people are individually signing as they get hired on today, first of all, to even be able to read one and understand it, you have to be like a mini lawyer, right? That's why most workers just sign it. It's like, and also, by the way, it's what you said. You say, I don't want to sign this piece of paper. They walk you to the door. Goodbye.
And so, we should say, like, obviously arbitrators are, they're professional. They try and do their best, but they also, guess who's not going to ever hire an arbitrator? That is an individual worker working at one of these places. I mean,
absolutely. But they also say really crazy stuff. They say you can't pool, like some of them say things like, literally, you cannot have class action lawsuits. You cannot pool your money.
Yep.
Each worker must individually pay the filing fee for arbitration, and for a whole lot of lower wage workers in this country, that first step is prohibitive. They don't even have the $500 to hire a lawyer to file for the arbitration. Like, it's feudalism. Yep. We are really, heading straight back into feudalism in some very crazy way in the workplace. So, what I do in that book, one of the most important things to me about this book, Sam, is that every single victorious story I tell takes place after Trump wins. And that's part of the point of the book, right? I'm like laying out story after story after story, and then breaking down the analysis of how workers are winning in a post-Trump world. Because what I'm trying to show is, Jesus, forget, impeachment. I mean, whatever. With the only choice that workers have, given the current Supreme Court, given the current campaign finance system, given just those two set of factors alone, given control of the media institutions, workers have one choice. in a very skewed political power structure right now. And by the way, that power structure is far worse than even last time you and I checked in together because of what's happening at that, not just the Supreme Court, but the astounding number of the federal judiciary that Trump has appointed, with McConnell just in there every damn day appointing judges, appointing judge, appointing judge, appointing judge. It is astounding. And so when you think about how stacked the judiciary is against workers' rights or the climate or, ending racism or sexism or fill in the blank, and then you look at the political system, people are like, right, Jane, well, what we need to do is overturn Citizens United, and then it's going to be fine. I'm like, great. Holy happy shit. How are you going to do that, right? Like, there's only one way left in this country to force the corporate elite to the table, and it's by increasing the number of mass strikes. It's the same. We are in 1932 in the United States, where income inequality and power inequality go hand in hand, where workers have virtually no say over what's going on in the economy, frankly, their personal lives at this point, because the economy is so controlling of their schedules. And I keep saying to people, look, whether or not the most dangerous president ever gets reelected by stealing the election, or whether or not a fantasy candidate like Sanders or a Warren gets in, under either scenario, there is no choice in this country, and I really deeply believe this given the power structure, but for massive strikes to begin breaking out, even way more than we've seen in the last 2 years. But workers are getting their muscle back. The success of the strikes is spreading. My day job, which is all about helping people figure out how they can build the kind of unity that it takes to strike, is the only way we're going to get out of this mess. And I keep saying to people, give me another option. Like, how are we going to do it? Well, we have to overturn Citizens United. That's not an option. That's not happening in the current political system, right? So give me another strategy that's going to cause the kind of crisis in the streets that can force the employer class to the bargaining table, and I mean at the federal level, right? The civil rights, the major pieces of worker legislation and civil rights legislation, by which I mean gender and race solutions in this country, all were the result of chaos being created, strategic, not stupid, strategic chaos being created in key geographies, in key moments, in key economic sectors, with the power to create the kind of crisis that forces federal legislation changes. There is no other way right now.
All right, now I wanted to get to Einstein, but let's stay on this for a little bit because this is the kit and caboodle to a certain extent. I mean, walk me through that a little bit. I mean, like, I know, like, the airlines, what the flight attendants did. On some level,
is leadership in the flight attendants. Yeah.
Yes, is to me is one of the best examples of the power of labor on something that ostensibly is not directly related, right? Like, it's not a one-to-one relationship. If we strike, there's not going to be any classes today.
Right.
It is if we strike, we're going to shut down, travel across the country, and that's going to cause headaches for our alumni. Like, walk us through. So the idea is that people, obviously vote, make your phone calls, choose a candidate. It's going to be helpful to have a pro-labor president who's maybe going to help in terms of like legislative acts and appointing judges who are going to rule and changing the National Labor Relations Board and changing the Labor Department. But at the end of the day, there has to be power on the street. This is the one thing that you can engage in that is you don't have to worry about where we're going to be in 6 months or even 6 years because all of it's going to be relevant. But how does that work? Like, give me your sense of, or is that not predictable? Is it impossible to predict sort of like what the chain of events are? Or is it you just like you do a certain thing, organizing, and good things will come from it?
Good question. So no, I mean, I would argue part of what I try and do in the book, right, is I'm walking back and forth between contemporary victories, how they work, and then I'm walking backwards into the early 1930s. And I do that because I am trying to show that the last time that we created the kind of crisis that leveled the power of corporate America is going to look a lot like this time, and that we had slightly more sense of strategy, I think, back then, but I think we're getting there right now, and that's what's encouraging. So if you look at the early 1930s, Great Depression happened. Part of what I try and argue in the book and show is that the misery factor right now, I actually think that the misery level is as high as it was in the Great Depression. It just plays out differently. It's profound. The number of underemployed, multiple employed, multiple jobs, can't see their kids, locking the kids in, whatever. I mean, the conditions when you get out of sort of like the middle class comfort of a handful of big cities where unions, frankly, still help make the states better, like a California, New York, a D.C., a handful of other places, it's miserable out there. There's an opioid crisis for a reason in this country. The birth rate's going down for a reason in this country. The suicide rate is up for a reason in this country. These are not funny statistics. They're sick, and the country is sick right now. So that's how it felt in the early 1930s, and we either were trending towards a authoritarian fascist outcome, which, by the way, did happen, as we well know, in the 30s in a whole lot of places, or we're going to head in a direction where that kind of misery translates into something that's progressive and popular. So in the 1930s, very smart trade union leaders understood the same dangers that very smart trade union leaders understand today, which is misery is taking us in one of two directions, and we better be leading our way out of this mess in a progressive way. So in the 30s, they targeted a handful of key industries, and let's just say that steel and auto, coal, a handful of the biggest industries were considered to be the most strategic industries. It was not workers in the trade unions trying to strike every Tom, Dick, and Harry workplace. It was not trying to strike every sector, and it was not trying to strike every city. It was a strategy that said there's a set of key industries, and if we strike those key industries and a handful of key geographies, by which I mean you do an overlay of the map. You figure out where the most pain's going to be caused. You figure out where the CEOs are going to feel it. You figure out where you can get away with the strike because the dogs and the guns and the batons and the hoses are not going to get called on you as badly as in another city, right? So all of this is like when you're making a national map to create a crisis to force the employer class to the table so that Congress can then fix the broken National Labor Relations Act and fix the broken Voting Rights Act and fix the broken Civil Rights Act and fix every single goddamn thing that Trump's forces are ruining right now, to restore them and make them even better is going to require strategic strikes in strategic labor markets, which sometimes cross a state line. And that is what we're seeing the beginning of. And I want to just say the only thing that the corporate elite in this country need from workers is that they show up and they go to work. It's the only thing they need. They don't want workers voting. They don't want poor people voting. The voter suppression laws, the Electoral College, the whole thing is going to screw up, our ability to sort of vote our way out of this process. So there's one thing and one thing only that has worked in this country to force radical changes, and that is when workers stop employers from earning money, and we need way more of it fast.
Okay, I'm getting flooded here with questions, but one of the things that I learned, and I've harped on this too many times, but this book Wrecked, about how the auto industry screwed themselves because they wanted to diminish the power of labor, and they changed their supply chain essentially on how they built cars. That ended up destroying the quality of their cars, U.S. cars. But through that, I understood the idea that you could have down the line in terms of a supplier, all you needed was a half a dozen people who work at the ball bearing plant that provides the ball bearings for one piece of equipment on the car, and they could shut everything down. And,
absolutely.
And so, as opposed to you don't need 30,000, factory workers to do this.
Exactly right.
You could have 5 guys who are in another shop outside of Detroit who are like, we're going on strike. We just shut down the supply line. And that's why, these car makers moved away from that to disempower workers like that. But you're saying that on a national scale that exists.
Have it.
Right. Okay. So who?
So, for example, look at where Bezos, crazy Jeff, crazy billionaire, should be cleaning toilets for poor people for the rest of his lives, in my opinion, Bezos is doing. I just saw he's guaranteeing 2-hour food delivery time if you're Prime or something, not just 2-day delivery on every package from God under the sun. Like, we are living in a just-in-time production moment in terms of a lot of the service economy, and that's why they hire profound union busters, right? Because they understand that like the logistics sector, I mean, if you took out 5 strategic Amazon warehouses, the whole thing's going down. There ain't no damn 2-day delivery happening if you know which 5 you need to pick. Similarly, in the airline industry, let's go back to Sarah Nelson and the flight attendant. She's the president of the Association of Flight Attendants, AFA. And when she stood up last year, close to this time last year, after the sickest, after Trump forcing 700,000 federal workers to come to work without paying them, right? That was going on every day for a month. People forget because the news cycle is so insane. So when he was doing that last year and people were like, the TSA workers should strike, the federal workers should walk off the job, that was a little bit naive because, frankly, they'll be fired in a second. But suddenly, a smart union decided, hey, our contract gives us the right to say, we don't have to board the airplane if the conditions are unsafe. That's the basic clause in the flight attendants union, that after several weeks of the TSA workers working overtime with no pay and deeply frustrated, and the FAA and the air traffic, everybody, the flight attendants just said, wait a minute, it's not safe to get on these planes anymore, and we're not going to get on them. And within hours, some air traffic controllers were like, LaGuardia didn't come to work, and within hours, the federal shutdown was over. So, when there's a storm, let's just go to a snowstorm. I got stuck in Chicago last week, right? I didn't get out because of one storm. And when one storm happens and a set of flights don't arrive, it causes chaos for days. The flight attendants union, the AFA, actually has a program called Operation Chaos. They understand very well that if flight attendants don't board a handful of strategic planes at a handful of moments, the entire system is going to go off, right? So there's a lot of possibility in this country for ordinary workers to force a reset of the power imbalance that's going on in this country. It's just that people need to start seeing it working, and that's the beauty of things like the Los Angeles teachers strike. I mean, when they walked out. Now, we're in exactly the 1-year anniversary, by the way. This week was the week that the 35,000 teachers in Los Angeles walked off the job, which had a ripple effect of, 1 million people's lives being affected. And they won an extraordinary series of improvements for the kids in those schools. That was not a fight about salaries. That was a fight about ending the kind of austerity that lets the billionaire elite of Silicon Valley live in California, not pay any damn taxes, disrupt and destroy the public school system, and the power of the LA teachers actually reset that power structure in Los Angeles, like the second largest city in the country. So there is, I say, not only is there a huge possibility of how we're going to reset the power imbalance and the disgusting racist, sexist, white nationalist crap going on in this country, but I'm waiting for someone to show me any other way. I don't see any other possibility for how we're going to fix the mess we're in, except for workers to start working off the job in the kind of numbers that we did in the early 1930s and the kind of numbers that we did in the mid-60s in the sort of public sector.
So who does, in the case, and folks can go back, I think we've spoken to Sarah Nelson at least 2 or 3 times since that strike, because I think, just conversations with you in the past, but just others. I could see that was something fundamentally different in terms of the way that it was, how strategic it was. That is a situation where it's reactive, right? Where the scenario is created by McConnell shutting down the government, and Sarah Nelson was adept enough to realize, like, oh, we're in a position, we have a lot of power in this situation. Where does that strategy come from when we're looking at a sort of in a proactive way, where we don't have a specific scenario? You talk about the broad misery, and it seems to me the difference between the misery in the 30s and today is one was a misery that left people idle enough that they could get together and meet. This misery is one that keeps people so busy that it becomes more of a challenge to organize on some level. But where does the proactive, like, who's sitting back and whose responsibility is it to sit back and say, I'm looking at this, supply chain that is the United States. We don't need the people, or maybe we need the people at this warehouse for Amazon to strike as opposed to that one, or this industry as opposed to that one. Like, who's doing that work?
Well, there are definitely.
Can you not tell me?
I mean, first of all, yeah, I can't tell you in great detail. Although I'm sure that the five most powerful, wealthy corporations of the world could tell us right now, since they're listening to everyone, right, from Alphabet to Google to Facebook to Amazon. But everyone's turning on those devices and letting them listen in their own homes. But anyway, not me. But anyway, so let's just start with Amazon. One of the most intractable corporations right now. Enormous growth spurt, super ripe for the kind of disruption that we're describing. There is, in fact, what we call a global table, which means there are a set of unions from all over the world, from Germany to the rest of Europe to here. One thing that's been different about my life since I spoke to you is I spent more than half a year last year working in Germany among the German unions and trying to get ahead of understanding some of the sectoral bargaining. The German Works Councils, come to it a different day if we want to, but the promise or peril of the system that people keep talking about. So I spent a lot of time in Europe, and I can tell you that there are very serious coordination conversations beginning about how to go after folks in the global supply chain, and that involves all different kinds of unions. Is it happening fast enough? Not from my view, right? I mean, the planet's burning down, literally in Australia, and flooding to death when we stop burning. And so, is it happening? Yes, it is. Do we need it to happen faster and better? Definitely. And part of the way that it's going to happen faster and better on the proactive side of this, and this takes me back to the education sector for a minute, because I actually do. I mean, I think the crisis of austerity, meaning the intentional withdrawal by the super rich and the corporate elite from the tax system, forcing what appears to be budget shortfalls that have an effect on the quality of life of everyday Americans, from how good's the public school system to Medicaid to Medicare to, is our water system poisoned? Is there a regulator there? Does anyone know, right? I mean, austerity is this really damning thing. On the proactive side, I think the best illustration of unions getting together and starting to say, we got to stop this because they're literally killing people, is in the education sector and some of those strikes, right? It's pretty impressive. I mean, there have been a set of progressive educators starting in 2012 in Chicago on the heels of the victory of the first Chicago teachers' strike, which re-raised workers' expectations, that actually, despite the rhetoric, despite the media attack, despite the public relations offensive against teachers and all workers, the strike still works when we do it well. The intentionality with which the California-based educators unions who went on strike last year, the planning that went into that, they were absolutely waking up every morning for several years saying, how can we reset a disgusting power imbalance where taxpayer money in California, the little bit that exists, is getting diverted to pro-corporate, meaning money-making, privatized education system, and away from the black and brown kids who fill the public schools in California. And the teachers took it and ran with it, and won, and are still winning, right? And now have a ballot initiative on the California ballot that's going to retax corporations in a massive way in this state, should it pass in November. And that 1-2 punch is the most brilliant strategic work, among the most brilliant strategic work I've seen going, is how do we first mobilize people around the picket lines and then take them to the polls, right? And actually get them voting in ballot measures that are going to make the super rich pay their taxes again. Because if we can't recreate a well-run regulatory system, as Trump is dismantling it day in and day out, we can't really take control of the lives of ordinary American workers. So there is some really smart, proactive stuff going on. Do we need more of it? Hell yes, way more of it.
Jay McAlevey, I could talk to you all day, but maybe we should do this again soon, because I would actually like to hear about your time in Germany. The book is A Collective Bargain: Unions Organizing in the Fight for Democracy. And folks, if you want to, I would start with no shortcuts, organizing for power in The New Gilded Age, I believe it was.
Yeah.
But get both books. We will put a link to both of them at majority.fm. Jane, always a pleasure to talk to you. Really fascinating and inspiring stuff.
Always a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks for the great work.
Bye-bye.